What's up everyone, it's King Moosh here with JCross X to welcome you all back for episode 7 of Unit Overview. In this series we'll be analyzing all the playable units in Fire Emblem 3 houses regarding their recruitment requirements, personal abilities, stats, spell lists, and everything in between to determine their strengths and limitations as a unit in your army. We will also be providing potential class recommendations for all these units, as well as ranking them on a tier list at the end of our analysis. These videos are generally gameplay focused, so we do our best to avoid story spoilers, but we always advise you to watch with discretion anyways, and if you haven't played 3 houses yet, we highly recommend that you do.
This episode will be focused on Caspar von Bergliez of the Black Eagles house. If you choose to teach the Black Eagles in Chapter 1, he will be automatically recruited and available to deploy for the mock battle. Recruiting him out of house isn't too difficult, however. Even though his beast support is locked to post time skip like Ferdinand, his requirements are a lot easier than his. The stat requirement is strength, same as Bernadetta in the last episode. He starts at 10 strength with no support, which means Byleth already qualifies for that part of his requirement even with no support since they have a base of 13 strength. As for the skill requirement, it's a bit more tricky but nothing too egregious, especially if you plan on playing as male Byleth. At no support, Caspar requires a C Brawling. This isn't too difficult to reach since multiple church staff have the ability to train Byleth in Brawling such as Yuritsa, Catherine, or Rhea, who is pretty much always available for faculty training. At C support, the requirement stays at C Brawl, but at C plus support, this is lowered to D plus Brawl, making it a bit more manageable. Unfortunately, the main downside not having access to his B support pre-time skip is that he won't randomly ask to join your class during the week, but his requirements are at least much more easier than Ferdinand. To reach his C plus support faster, you can give him some of his favorite gifts. This list includes the Training Weight, Whetstone, Hunting Dagger, and Smoked Meat. You also should try and look for his lost items. Starting in Chapter 3, you can find his Tattered Overcoat in the training rounds. One chapter later, you can figure out that Caspar is a Catherine fanboy apparently by locating his Thunderbrand replica, which has also been lost in the training grounds. His last item can be found starting in Chapter 11 in the Dining Hall, that being the Grounding Charm. Tea parties are also a useful mechanic that can raise support, and to have an easier time with Caspar specifically, you can use his singular favorite tea blend, being Ginger Tea. He also likes the Crestfeld blend and Lester Cortania like every other unit too. As for his crest, Caspar has none, which really isn't a bad thing for him specifically. He could take advantage of the fact that Hero's Relics damage him since some of his better builds revolve around the low HP builds in the enemy phase, which we'll talk about soon.
Caspar's personal ability is Born Fighter. It reduces the avoid of all enemies adjacent to him by 10. He does not need to actually attack an enemy to activate it, just being adjacent is enough. Essentially, this is just a weaker version of Heartseeker, a class ability of Dark Mage and Dark Bishop. Theoretically, if you took Caspar down that class line, you could stack them together for a minus 30 avoid debuff. Anyways, this is a simple but excellent ability. Due to Caspar's skill affinities, he usually prefers to attack at melee range anyways, so this is pretty much a constant buff to his own accuracy from the very beginning of the game. Not only that, but if Caspar acts before your other units, all your other units can also benefit from increased accuracy on any of the enemies he's adjacent to. In fact, you may be able to benefit from this against different enemies in the same player phase. He may be adjacent to one enemy at the start of the player phase, and then after he moves, he is now adjacent to a new enemy. It's an extremely consistent buff that applies regardless of what phase you're in or what you're choosing to attack with, including gambits. Since it helps both Caspar and all your other units, it's pretty much impossible to not get value out of it. The only unfortunate thing about it is that minus 10 avoid doesn't make quite as much of a difference on accuracy as Ignat's or Ferdinand's personals. However, unlike those, it does have the benefit of potentially helping your other units instead of just Caspar. It also may not have as high potential impact as some of the damage focused abilities, but its consistency keeps it among the more useful personal abilities in the game.
Caspar is a decent set of skill levels, but nothing groundbreaking by any means. We'll start with the positives first though, being his boon and axes and brawling. Some of his best mid to late game class options usually focus on axes and brawl, which are definitely his favorite weapon types. This allows him to certify classes like Brigand, Warrior, Grappler, War Master, and even the Wyvern class is a bit easier if you so desire. Pushing his brawling earlier is also not a bad idea, since he does get Bombard, a brave brawling combat art that I'll talk about in a bit more detail later. Caspar unfortunately has no budding talents, so I'll skip straight to his Banes. He has 3, one in Bows, Reason, and Authority. Reason is mostly irrelevant since Caspar has a bad magic stat and a subpar spell list. However, the other 2 Banes are definitely unfortunate to say the least. As for Bows, they are one of the best weapon types in 3 houses, and raising them to C for the guaranteed arch certification is important for most units, especially Caspar since hit plus 20 can help offset the middling accuracy of the axe weapon type. It also has a mild synergy with his personal too. As for Authority, it's one of the most important skills to rank up fast. Battalions are quite impactful in this game, and being able to use higher tier ones with better stats is appreciated on pretty much every unit. The only times the higher tier ones aren't necessary is on support units, who mostly just use supportive gambits such as Impregnable Wall and Stride. Overall, his skill ranks aren't the worst since at the very least he has a boon for the weapon types he'd use a majority of the time, but in reality, it is just the bare minimum. Meanwhile, 2 of his Banes are somewhat impactful and skills that are relatively important in this game.
Moving on to the base stats, this is where things begin to look a lot worse for Caspar. Let's start with the ones that I don't have any complaints about. His base luck is 8, which is actually tied for the highest in the game with a few other units. His base strength of 9 is on the higher end of average too, which is nice. That's pretty much everything good I can say. Unfortunately, his base dex is only 5, which drags down the benefits of his luck for accuracy and crit rate. Additionally, his base charm is only 4, which is also very subpar, though his personal ability does help offset the lower gambit accuracy. Obviously, his base magic is very low at only 3, but that doesn't matter much. Looking at the defenses, he has 26 HP and 6 defense at base, which isn't necessarily bad, but is significantly less bulky than other brawlers like the Dew, Raphael, and Balthus. Meanwhile, he doesn't get any benefits in speed to make up for the weaker defensive profile. In fact, his base speed of 6 is quite bad, somehow even lower than the Dew and Balthus. This often puts him at the exact speed tier to consistently get doubled by almost every enemy in early game matinee difficulty. As you would probably expect, his bulk on the magic side is even worse with a base res of 2. When considering HP, defense, res, and speed altogether, Caspar is very likely the most fragile unit in the early game. He is pretty much always at risk of being one-rounded, while not being nearly good enough offensively to make up for it. This is very likely the single worst set of base stats in the game. As for his growth rates, they're definitely a lot better than his bases, but still nothing special. His best one is HP, which is a very solid 55%, but everything else is below 50%. His defense and res are only 30% and 20% respectively, so despite his HP, he really isn't all that bulky. His magic is once again obviously bad at only 25%, but more importantly, his charm growth is also 25%, which is very subpar, especially when factoring in his low base. On the bright side, his speed growth is 45%, which isn't anything too high, but is a lot higher than the other brawlers I previously mentioned. Despite his poor start, he does end up being a lot faster than those bulkier brawlers later in the game. As for his offensive stats, his strength and dex growth are 45% and his luck is 40%. These are all pretty solid, but he doesn't stand out in any area. I suppose his damage, accuracy, and crit rates will likely scale pretty well throughout the game, but not nearly well enough to justify how bad he is in the early game.
Caspar has a fair amount of dependent combat arts, most of which aren't anything too special, but one of them is pretty nice to have. I'll start with the ones he gets from axes, of which the selection is pretty mediocre. At C axes, he unlocks Wild Abandon, which is a pretty volatile combat art. While it does boost might by 10 and crit by a massive 30, it comes at the cost of 5 durability, which is pretty standard for axe combat arts, while also having a minus 30 penalty to hit. Honestly, there's really no reason to use this combat art over Smash, given the fact that Smash provides a still very respectable 20 to crit, 3 to might, and a very appreciated plus 20 to hit that allows axe users to be a lot more consistent. Critical hits generally one-round most enemies a majority of the time, so the higher might boost from Wild Abandon isn't too impactful, since axes are already the highest damaging weapon type, with the cost of being the least accurate. Having an art drop hit by 30 is too much of a downside and too inconsistent in most regular setups. His only other axe combat art arrives at A axes, being Exhaustive Strike. This art has a measly plus 3 to might and a plus 10 to hit, with only costing 1 durability. If that's what it was in a vacuum, that would actually be pretty nice and a cheap alternative to Smash. However, what this combat art does is add all of the remaining durability left on the weapon you are using and add it to the attack's damage, but only 30% of it, so even if you had max durability left on a Steel Axe Plus, it would only add around an extra 20 damage. This is basically a poor man's vengeance that also breaks your weapon at the same time. If you have room in Caspar's inventory and want to have a few max durability axes for nuke options, that is actually not a bad way to use the art. However, crit builds are generally less of a hassle and usually lead to easier 1-rounds, so this is relatively moot combat art. As for his other arts, he gets 2 brawling ones. At C+, he unlocks Bombard, which is a very simple but really nice brawling combat art. It has the Brave effect, so like Gauntlets, it will double the enemy consecutively, and for 3 durability, it provides a plus 3 to might and a plus 10 to crit, which in reality is a bit more impactful due to the aforementioned doubling. Like I said, it's a simple art, but one that can be spammed given its cheap durability cost and improved lethality over normal Gauntlet attacks, solidifying Caspar as a really good user of this weapon type. At A Brawl, Caspar unlocks Mighty Blow, which unfortunately loses the Gauntlet's Brave effect, but does have a higher might boost of plus 10, while granting a plus 20 to crit. In practice, this art doesn't really do that much, as the plus 10 to might isn't enough to offset the fact that you're losing an extra attack, especially since Bombard basically has a plus 6 to might. Honestly, Mighty Blow just really isn't worth using on a final build. If I had to choose 3 combat arts for Caspar, it would be Smash, Bombard, and either Curve Shot or a positional combat art like Shove.
There's very little to discuss about Caspar's dependent abilities because he only gets a single one, Battalion Wrath, obtained at rank C Authority. We've gone over this ability a good few times already, but to recap, it activates only when your Battalion Endurance is at or below 1/3 of its maximum endurance. When Battalion Wrath is active, if an enemy initiates combat with you, you will receive a massive plus 50 boost to crit. This only applies during the enemy phase, not the player phase. The best use of it for Caspar, in our opinion at least, is to pair it alongside Vantage to start enemy phasing in the early game. It helps that Caspar lacks a crest, which makes it easier to activate Vantage using the self-damage from Hero's Relics. However, his authority bait makes this setup require significantly more time and investment, which takes away from the main benefit of the build in the first place. If you're not running Vantage, Battalion Wrath is best used on either dodge tanks or prod tanks in order to actually survive enemy phasing. Frankly, Caspar isn't very well suited for either of those roles unless you give him a whole lot of stat boosting items. He doesn't have particularly high speed or defense growth, though for a dodge tank setup, he could potentially benefit a lot from Warmonk's mastery ability, Brawl Avoid plus 20. That being said, I do think that enemy phase and dual phase setups based around crits can be very strong on Caspar for reasons we'll elaborate more on later when I discuss his build options. There may also be some niche applications for Battalion Wrath that I haven't really accounted for here. Overall though, I wouldn't say this is a very high priority ability to obtain. You will probably end up unlocking it naturally at some point just by raising your authority rank to get access to stronger battalions, but unless you're specifically planning to pair with Vantage, I wouldn't be in too much of a hurry to obtain it.
Caspar is definitely not really meant to be taken down the magic path, and that shows in his spell list. He has one of the most barren lists, having only 2 reason spells and 3 faith ones. Starting with the reason list, he gets fire at D, which is solid. It has decent damage, a fair amount of uses, and more importantly a good hit rate, making it one of the most consistent early game spells. Aside from that, he also gets Bolganon at C reason, which has slightly less uses and accuracy compared to fire, but gains a fair increase in might going from 3 to 8. Moving on to his faith spell list, he unlocks heal and Nosferatu at D and D plus faith, just like all other units, providing standard healing and white magic damage. Other than that, Caspar gets recover at C faith, which has less uses than the spell heal, but more might, causing it to heal more. This is somewhat useful for Caspar since his own magic is pretty dismal, so the stronger heal is appreciated. Not like it matters much though, as with very little to focus on in the magic stat, a Reason Bane, and having pretty much no unique or impactful spells to his name, Caspar is one of the worst contenders for magic classes in general.
Caspar does have a few strengths going for him. His access to Bombard puts him on the higher end of Gauntlet wielders in this game, since most units don't get any Brave Brawling combat arts. Gauntlets are a very powerful weapon type, so being a good user of them already helps him stand out a bit. Unlocking Bombard grants him a pretty substantial power spike, and this can be done quite early due to his boon and raised base rank in Brawling. On the topic of his boons, having boons in both Brawling and Axes gives him a pretty easy low investment class path through great classes like Brigand, Grappler, and War Master, as well as the Wyvern classes. This lets him take advantage of the benefits of classes in order to patch up his own weaknesses. Also, as I mentioned before, his personal ability is quite useful and maintains relevancy throughout the entire game for more reliable accuracy, which is very useful in maddening. Highly mobile classes like Wyvern Lord are probably the best choice for supporting his teammates with his personal ability due to the positional flexibility they offer. When you consider these factors alongside his decent growth rates, he generally has pretty solid combat performance in the late game. Compared to most other Brawling candidates who are usually very min-maxed in bulk and strength, he will often have better speed and crit rates, which can be valuable in certain builds. Caspar, alongside Mercedes, is also required to be recruited in order to access a paralog battle called the Face Beneath. It's available starting in Chapter 15 on all routes except Crimson Flower, and it grants some useful rewards like the Raphael Gem Relic, as well as the Scythe of Sariel, which is only obtainable if Caspar defeats the Death Knight himself.
Caspar honestly struggles quite a bit as a unit, and there are definitely some weaknesses to highlight. I want to bring attention to something that Josh mentioned earlier when talking about his stats, and that's definitely his early game. While his growths are okay, and his strength will definitely be quite above average in the late game assuming Caspar isn't super unlucky with level ups, his early game is pretty bad. His bases are probably some of the worst in the game if I'm being quite honest. He is comically vulnerable in the first few chapters as he doesn't have as high of HP or defense as Dedue, Raphael, or Balthus to shrug off attacks, whilst also being just as slow, if not slower than some of them. His strength is pretty good, but it isn't exceptional, not enough to save him from the fact that most of his other stats, aside from luck, are subpar. It really is a slog to get him through the first few chapters, and honestly he becomes a bit of a viability. Moving on, we have his skill ranks. While the 2 boons he has are pretty much all you really will ever need, it's mildly unfortunate that he didn't have an extra one in another useful skill like Flying or Authority, of which he actually has a Bane in the latter, alongside Bows, which can be mildly annoying. I will recognize that Bombard is a great combat art and makes him stand out a fair bit in the Brawling archetype in general, but there are a few other units who get brave Brawling combat arts such as Felix and Alois, so it isn't too much of a unique advantage to have. Honestly, aside from Bombard, there really aren't too many unique elements to him as a unit, which basically means he is one of the units who is generally the least valuable or most replaceable given his lack of unique attributes. I could also say his spell list is bad too and consider that a weakness, but I'm not going to harp on him too much considering he almost never has a reason to even consider a magic-focused class. Overall, Caspar is a simple unit that actually has decent stats later given his growths, but with nothing too unique to build around in a bad early game, he definitely feels pretty underwhelming for most of a playthrough.
The beginner classes are usually a pretty simple choice for Caspar. He can certify for Fighter without any investment because of his starting Axe rank. Not only is it the easiest one to certify into, but its mastery ability, Strength plus 2, is also the most useful one for Caspar out of all the beginner class mastery abilities. It's a consistent damage buff that applies twice when using gauntlets, so he definitely appreciates this and will likely stick around in his build for quite a while. The only other one I would maybe consider is Myrmidon to patch up his base speed with speed +2, but this will require a lot of early investment in the swords, which may be better spent elsewhere. As for the intermediate classes, the most logical one to certify for is Brigand. It's once again the easiest for him to certify into because of his axe boon and initial rank. Most importantly, as mastery ability, Death Blow is one of the best abilities in the game, and we highly recommend prioritizing it. It provides a massive +6 boost to physical damage when initiating combat, which once again applies twice when using gauntlets. This will provide a major power spike to your damage output and pairs excellently with Bombard. It will likely stay in your build for the entire game unless you decide to commit to a full enemy phase setup. As for other intermediate classes, there aren't a lot of great options. Brawler is easy for him to certify into, but it is honestly a really bad class that we would highly recommend against using. The Strain stat boost from Brigand is more useful for combat performance with gauntlets than anything that Brawler provides. If you're willing to put in the early investment into swords, you may want to consider certifying for Thief as early as possible to patch up his low base speed. The same thing applies for his base defense if you're willing to invest a bit in heavy armor to certify for Armor Knight, though I wouldn't say it's as important as Thief. You don't have to actually use either of these classes, just certifying for the base stats is enough. If you're raising swords for Thief anyways, you may also want to take the time to master Mercenary. Vantage can be great on both early game and late game Caspar builds, but he has many other good builds, so it's not required. Alternatively, you can also use Hero during the advanced stage as another way of accessing Vantage, since it has Vantage as a class ability. The only other class I want to mention is Archer, which is usually something we recommend on almost every unit during the intermediate stage due to its mastery ability hit +20. It's one of the best abilities in the game, especially in maddening difficulty, because it makes your accuracy much more reliable. However, for Caspar, this class is hard to certify into because of his Bowbane, and he already gets an accuracy boost from his personal ability. Therefore, it's debatable if the amount of investment necessary to make him an archer is actually worth it. I personally do make him an archer most of the time once I'm done mastering Brigand, but I could definitely see the logic for skipping it completely.
Taking a look at Caspar's recommended advanced classes, there are a few that are important to point out. This is the stage of the game where brawling classes start to become good, and as such, Grappler is one of his best options. It has respectable stat boosts, Fistfare, and Fierce Iron Fist, which is easily one of the best combat arts present within this game. Not only that, but it's relatively mobile for an infantry class at 6 move, while also having the thief-like movement archetype, more commonly known as forest walking. As for axe classes, Warrior is decent given its hyperfixation on strength, but given the fact that Caspar already has Battalion Wrath in his dependent abilities list, mastering Warrior is more of a matter of personal preference if you don't just want to use Battalion Wrath. There are valid reasons for using either, and Josh will elaborate more on the differences in the build section. Wyvern Rider is easily the best combat-focused axe class in the advanced stage, and generally just one of the best combat classes in the entire game. It is important to note though that you can only really focus on axes when in this class, as gauntlets are not compatible with mounted classes. As for the master class options, there really only are two. If you want to continue down the Wyvern line, Wyvern Lord is the obvious choice. There really isn't too much to be said that already hasn't been said about this class. 8 move, flight with Canto and Axe Fair, insane stat boosts, and a dose of aura. This class barely lacks anything, and honestly is at the bare minimum a decent fit for most physical units. As for what we believe is probably his best though, War Master is a great option. War Master Strike is easily a better axe combat art than anything he gets in his dependent axe art list. It also has access to Quick Riposte, a really nice ability that prevents enemy counterattacks when above certain HP thresholds, while guaranteeing your own when an enemy initiates combat with your unit. While Caspar isn't the slowest, he'll rarely ever be able to be in the realm of doubling during the player phase, unless using gauntlets of course, and as such, this serves as a really nice way to give him enemy phase viability, and pairs really nicely with Battalion Wrath, since Caspar himself doesn't have to be at low HP. This kind of setup allows for flexible dual phase builds, which can be really fun. Other than that, War Master's main appeal is the fact that it has both Axe to Fistfare and Axe Fair's class abilities, meaning Caspar can swap between the weapon types freely depending on the situation. On top of a really nice third class ability in crit +20, this makes War Master generally his most ideal fit, providing pretty much everything a unit like him could need.
Unfortunately, Caspar is going to be the first unit we put into the C- tier, the lowest tier we have on the list. I do think there are a few units that are slightly worse than him, but not by enough to put him in a different tier. He's not a bad unit at all in the late game, but there's just not really anything uniquely strong about him to justify having to carry him through the early game, in which it can often be a liability. His out-of-house performance is arguably better, since he will automatically get D-bows just for becoming a fighter before you recruit him. He will be skipping the first 2 chapters, which are usually the hardest for him, and it gives him some time to grow out of his poor base stats. That being said, we still don't think his out-of-house performance is good enough to justify putting him any higher. He can make up for the Bowbane a bit, but having an Authority Bane is still crippling. It's probably the single worst skill to have a Bane in. However, don't let this placement discourage you from using him. Even the worst units in this game are still really good, and like I said, he's definitely not the worst unit anyways. He's totally capable of becoming a powerhouse with the right build. As for his best endgame class, we think War Master is the best option for him. Like most units, he can be a good Wyvern Lord, but it lacks Fistfare and disables brawling access while mounted, so it's not something I usually go with personally since I like to take advantage of his brawling. For those of you who do use Wyvern Lord Caspar or any other classes, please leave your builds in the comments, because the only ones we have in mind are generic builds that don't warrant a lot of discussion. Grappler is also a good option, but I think Fierce Iron Fist is a bit less enticing when you already have a great brawling combat art like Bombard, so I would once again give the advantage to War Master. From my personal experience, dual-facing crit builds have been the best way to use Caspar, given his well-balanced stat spread. There are two different ways I usually go about this, those being one low HP setup based around Vantage Wrath, and one high HP setup based around Quick Riposte and Battalion Wrath, but they're both very viable. One slot on both builds is usually reserved for buffing his accuracy, though because of his personal ability, you may not find as necessary in your playthrough. This is where I really appreciate hit plus 20 if you did take the time to master Archer, since it makes him more consistent with both axes and gauntlets using just one slot. If you don't have hit plus 20, you'll want to use at least one of either Brawling Prowess 5 or Axe Prowess 5, if not both. The next slot, once again on both builds, is dedicated to Death Blow, which helps keep your player phase damage up. The remaining slots are mostly just filler. Brawl Crit plus 10 and Axe Crit plus 10 can be used to patch up your crit rates if they're not high enough without them. Scrape plus 2 is never a bad option, especially when accounting for doubling and crits, which both make the damage boost more significant. This requires a lot of investment, but you can also unlock Fistfare or Axefare from the S+ skill rank and Brawling or Axer respectively, which you can stack with the class abilities for even more damage. On the Quick Riposte build, it can be helpful to have self-sustain options like Life Taker to keep your HP up, if you're willing to put in the investment to master Dark Bishop. Generally, the gameplay loop of these builds are very similar to each other. During the player phase, you will nuke enemies using either Smash with the Killer Axe Plus, or Bombard with Killer Knuckles Plus, which both have very high crit chances. Then, during the enemy phase, crits are pretty much guaranteed because of Wrath or doubling with Quick Riposte. Personally, I find the Vantage Wrath build more consistent, and you can start using it earlier since you don't have to master War Master first. That being said, Quick Riposte is an incredibly strong ability, so choosing to build around it once it's unlocked is a very valid decision. That's about all we have to say about Caspar. If you enjoyed the video or have any thoughts of your own, please leave a like and make sure to comment. I also recommend checking the description if you're not already subscribed to both of our channels. Stay tuned for the next episode of Unit Overview, which is about the next member of the Black Eagle House, Petra McNeary, on Jeff's channel this Saturday. Thanks for watching.